digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're joined by Steve from Amplified Robots and Kristen from Tello. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to ask you both to explain who you are and what it is you do. Let's start with you, Kristen.
Hi, I'm Kristen Baker. I'm the president and CEO of tellofilms.com. And we are a web-based distribution company that makes original series specifically for the lesbian audience. And we have been around for about 8 years now, and we produce original content, and we're sort of like the Netflix for the lesbian community.
Wonderful. And Steve, why don't you reacquaint our listeners with exactly what you do over at Amplified Robot?
Right, if I can remember what it is. Basically, I'm Steve. I'm the CEO of Amplified Robot, and we work in augmented reality and virtual reality space. I have the great pleasure, actually, of running a couple of other companies, the major one of which is called Medical Realities, which is training doctors and surgeons using virtual reality.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I know that for people who've listened to some of our previous sessions, they'll be familiar with Steve and a session where we discussed the future of VR and what we ended up with was the future of AR. So let's recap where we got to with that conversation, because I do think it merits further investigation. So, Steve, why don't you explain to us what the theory was and how we came to it, so that Kristen is all caught up?
Yes, I think we netted out really that virtual reality is going to be important, but is probably not going to be as important as augmented reality, and that's partly because what's good about virtual reality is it's immersive. But that's also could be bad about virtual reality is that it tends to be possibly a very singular experience, whereas augmented reality can in actual fact be opened up to everybody because you're not totally immersed and cut off from other senses at the same time.
This is indeed so. And I think for us, the point that we got to was that there is going to be this need to completely relearn the language of filmmaking in order to successfully execute what we would consider as good quality VR. And in the context of that relearning and reteaching ourselves how to speak, if you like, there is this interesting notion that actually AR may be the thing that facilitates mainstream consciousness into these arenas of storytelling versus VR, which is actually very insular. It's very niche. It's very much something that's embraced by the gaming community, and it's something that's kind of looked upon with confused interest by the film industry, but hasn't necessarily been conquered yet by the film industry. I think people can immediately see the value for VR in gaming, but they're not necessarily 100% there yet in terms of film, and they're certainly not anywhere near it in terms of music. So I think it's an interesting point that perhaps this focus and this attention that's being put into VR is misplaced. And I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on this, Kristen, because I know that you're at the early stage of exploring VR. So to hear from somebody who's very immersed in this space, pardon the pun, for somebody like Steve to say that actually he doesn't think the future is necessarily in VR, but perhaps in AR, what would be your response to that kind of a statement?
I think first I understand VR from a storytelling perspective a little bit more than I do AR. So, from a storytelling perspective, we do want to, my challenge as a filmmaker is to get people to sit in front of something and forget what is around them and forget what their current reality is. And so that's why I am so fascinated by VR more than AR, because now I have an even greater ability. If I can literally block someone's peripheral vision and make it to what I want them to see and truly immerse them in the storytelling piece of this, narratively speaking, I'm never speaking from a gaming perspective, right? I'm always speaking from a storytelling perspective. If I can sort of block out their senses. And I don't mean this in like I sound almost like a scary draconian person, but if I can
You're not a control freak at all, are you?
I know I'm not. But if I can control their senses, if I can know that if they turn to the left or to the right, they're going to see what my world has created for them to see. That's what gets me a little bit more excited than AR, where it is that sort of blended reality. And there's a lot of, I think AR is interesting, but from a storytelling perspective, I can control VR and can control the story a little bit more than I think I can with AR. And I have to say, Steve, I'm definitely coming from a place, a little bit more of ignorance, with AR. So, there might be something that you say that will totally get me to change my mind. But from my perspective, let me block out everything so that I know they're in my world.
No, I think that's the good thing about virtual reality. I think that you certainly have a person's total attention when they're immersed with the AR headset on, and that's a great place from a director, a storyteller, to have their audience totally in the palm of their hand, and you can take them on a journey with no distraction at all, because once you actually sort of put that together with the sound that they have got, they are totally blocked off from every other sense. I think that don't get me wrong, I think virtual reality is important, but we were just sort of looking at the overall space of where things are going to be in 5 or 10 years' time, where really that VR will be important, but that probably augmented reality will be more important because it will be used in more ways and for more things. But virtual reality is a very important part of what's coming in the future.
So let me throw this into the ring between the two of you, because I'm sensing that there's almost two sides to this discussion going on. But let me throw this into the ring, which is the notion that has come up several times now in previous conversations on the Digital Jam sessions, and that is that actually things like VR and even to a certain extent AR are not truly going to become mainstream until we actually remove some of the friction involved in actually experiencing them. So this idea that in order to experience VR, you have to put this big ugly black box on your head and look like a bit of a geeky nerd, which is not something that many people are necessarily going to be comfortable with unless they are a gamer, unless they are already very enthusiastic about that kind of environment. But if we're talking about average cinema goer, those kind of people, it took a long time for people to be convinced to even put on a pair of 3D glasses, let alone a big old box on top of their head.
Yeah, and I think some people are still hesitant for those 3D glasses.
So I suppose the question really is that do we feel like perhaps it's not even a question of AR versus VR? Is it a question around the facilitation of the experience? I know that Imre mentioned in our previous conversation with Steve, this idea of pumping stuff directly into the brain, which sounds a little bit kind of far-fetched and out there. But at the same time, it is that thing of when do we get to that stage where it is seamless and it's totally something that doesn't feel like there's friction to experience? Is that the point at which this thing becomes mainstream? Is that the point at which people will accept the notion of that very, I'm going to use the word controlling storytelling, and allow them to be led because of the fact that the technology doesn't make them feel uncomfortable, doesn't make them feel socially uncomfortable, as well as emotionally and mentally uncomfortable?
Yeah, I think what the equipment is preventing, and again, this is my very early on guess around this, but I agree with you that I don't know that it prevents it from going mainstream. I think as a storyteller, again, you have to be cognizant of what gear they will have. And I think it's going to be difficult to have someone watch a full length movie. I think it would be difficult for, someone to sit there for 90 minutes in this immersive space. I think that's really taxing potentially on people, depending on how heavy the equipment is. But I think, I think it could still be mainstream, but I think how often people use it and for how long is what might cause some that's where I feel like maybe the friction point will be, again, until they can sit somehow on your face in a lighter way. But that's where I feel like the friction point is. You can only look at a Google Cardboard for so long before your arms start to hurt. And so that, I mean, and that's where I think that's where I do think AR might outperform VR as far as going into mainstream, because you already have things like Google Glass that at least have a prototype of something sitting on your face, so that you can then populate it with different things that might, I don't know if that's too close to the eye or what, but I think AR, you could look around your room potentially and see things and stories much easier than you could with VR and hold those on there. But, I'm not teaching kids, how to be med students in that way. So, I mean, I don't know, Steve, you tell me.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting learning curve. At the moment, we're sort of seeing that people have a sort of tolerance for virtual reality, a virtual reality immersive piece of maximum probably about 8 to 10 minutes. But I think that part of that is because it is so new, and I look at it back onto almost exactly a parallel to how people viewed and took on board the cinema over 100 years ago, because early cinema was only shown in bite-sized pieces of upwards of 10 minutes at a time. And I think it's going to be something that people will learn to actually assimilate longer and longer types of immersion. But that's also going to go in with how the actual sort of technology evolves, and it will make the visors and the viewers that people are wearing much lighter, look much better. And hopefully, at some point or another, they'll hardly even realise that they're wearing something on in front of their eyes.
Yeah, Steve, they said the same thing. Like, they called it Disney's folly, when people were convinced no one would watch an animated movie. Yeah. And and
look at us now.
I mean, I say that, and I could have been one of those people that said no one will watch a cartoon for a whole hour, but. I agree with you. I think the technology piece is the hamper to that, but that will just get smaller and smaller and lighter and lighter.
And at the rate at which technology is kind of moving forwards, I don't think it's going to take a huge amount of time. I mean, I recall seeing a story not just the other week about contact lenses that could help to create 20/20 vision, and they're not laser surgery type contact lenses. They just go in with an eye wash, and then they unfold onto the surface of the eye, and no surgery needed. You have 20/20 vision. So, when we're talking about the way that technology is moving forward, I think we're probably going to get to that contact lens stage really quickly. And it won't be another decade before we get to that stage where actually this whole visor thing is obsolete.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I think contact lenses are definitely going to come in there. I mean, with virtual reality, we've been at this sort of stage before in the late 80s and early 90s, and the reason it didn't really continue to take off at that point was that the technology just wasn't keeping pace with people's imaginations, and the technology was too clunky. Now, the great thing about it now, I get a genuine feeling that the technology is keeping pace with people's ideas, and in the next 2 or 3 years will start to outpace it.
I think that's an interesting point that you raise, actually, Stephen. As much as innovation in any creative industry at this moment in time has never been quite so easy to facilitate now as in any other point in history. It feels like things happen very, very quickly now, and new startups and new services are emerging all of the time in terms of ways of distributing content or ways of creating content or ways of sharing content. Just seem to be moving at such a rapid pace, and anybody with a good idea these days really does have the potential and the methods to be able to share that idea with the masses in a very, very short space of time. So I do think that there's something really interesting at the moment in terms of that evolution of the technology. But I'm curious from your perspective, Steve, in terms of the experiences that you've had with VR, obviously there are some key learnings that we've discussed in previous sessions where we talked about that idea of movement and motion within VR. But I'm curious if you were sharing some of those initial thoughts about what really does work, or what you have established so far works within VR. As we said, nobody has all of the answers, but is there something that you would say at this moment in time really does work well?
Oh, yes, I wish we did have all the answers. Yeah, we're very much starting at the very beginning of trying to figure out how we should be doing some of these things and how we should be telling the stories without actually making people feel ill while we're doing it. And part of the things is that we steer well clear of is obviously too much movement on the camera, because that can actually feel difficult for people wearing the headsets, because they don't actually know what's going on. They want to be able to move their head around and see everything around them. So anything that's done has to be done very smoothly. You can't use sort of tricks of cutaways and fast cuts, because again that starts to disorientate people very well. And I think that it's partly the actual challenge is the viewer becomes the camera as well. So they can look anywhere around them. That's also the great challenge for the VR filmmaker, is if you're telling a narrative, and you want to get people to look at a particular part of the 360-degree panorama around them, how do you get them to look at exactly what you want them to look at exactly the right time? And we're at the moment we're using certain tricks like sound is a very good one, because that's a very good way of attracting attention, but also people walking past and almost sort of Shakespearean-like stage direction, where you've got the narrator on stage almost sometimes saying, "Well, actually, you should look behind you right now because something really interesting is happening." Those are the type of things that we're using at the moment. But right now, it's a great place to be, but it's also quite a scary place, because we're trying to reimagine something right the way from scratch, which is very exciting, but also quite scary.
It's interesting that you talk about sound, because I know that one of the conversation pieces around a lot of the people who I've been speaking to about VR has been around the use of binaural sound rather than traditional sound, if you like. And that notion of being able to guide people through a soundscape, so to speak. And one of the real early adapters in this particular arena was a mobile game called Papa Sangria, which was a game completely created using only sound. So you played the game with a pair of headphones on and the mobile phone in your hand, but you didn't look at the mobile phone. You didn't have to look at the mobile phone. You changed direction using your thumbs to be able to go left or right and move using the phone itself, but you didn't have to look at it. And so it's one of the first games that could genuinely be played by somebody who is completely blind. And what's interesting is how do you map an entire world that needs to be explored from a gaming perspective, and somebody needs to move through that environment, but you're doing it all with sound. So how do you let them know that there's a mountain in front of them, but there's a door to the right of them that they need to go through? It's a very interesting challenge, from an audio perspective. And I think that there's probably some lessons there that could be taken from something like Papa Sangria and utilised in VR filmmaking.
I totally agree with that. It's going to make sound even more important in the future, and it really is. I think you're quite correct in saying it is mapping it out. That we're going to have to do a lot of very, very precise storyboarding, not only the visuals, but storyboarding of sound as well, and actually creating dubbing charts so that we know exactly at what point certain sounds happen, but in what perspective they happen. Are they happening in front of you, to the side of you, behind you, or are they travelling around you? And if they are, in what direction? So it's going to make a lot of sound editors extremely happy, because that's the type of thing they love to do.
Indeed.
Well, and Steve, is there I wonder too, what are the implications for just how, we were talking earlier about keeping a steady camera because the person watching it is also the camera, and what's the sound as you move your head. If you're in a party room and you're focused in on two people in front of you, as you turn your head and turn to see something else, if you're in sort of like a sandbox type of environment, do you then move and hear them speaking as you key in on them? And,
Absolutely.
Again, like you're right. Like what's the sound editing around that when how do you stitch that piece together?
Exactly. And the binaural sound is totally the key to this. It really enhances the virtual reality experience. And it's like everything like that if it's done badly, it can also make the experience sort of quite awful, but
or make me violently sick.
And I think with a lot of these things, we played around for a long time with 5.1 and surround sound and 7.1, and now Dolby are going into producing a thing called Atmosphere, which funny enough will actually translate extremely well into virtual reality. So they've got a little winner on their hands there. So not only are they going to use it for the cinema, but they're also going to use it in virtual reality as well.
Having said that, and just kind of talking about that idea that there are learnings to be had from the games industry to VR, do you think there are any other kind of key aspects of the games industry that you think could be applied to VR?
Oh, I think, to be quite honest, I think that gaming is totally important. I think you have to understand how games are put together. I think you have to understand the structure of gaming, because in exactly the same way, you will have to work in the same sort of constraints, but use also the same types of techniques to mask those constraints from the viewer. Because in reality, the games you think you might be sort of wandering all around Paris in Assassin's Creed, but in essence you're actually sort of wandering around a sort of fairly constrained square. So that if it was unfolded, you'd actually be sort of wandering around something which was only about half a square mile, but it feels like you're going for miles in certain directions. And there are certain tricks and techniques that we can actually get from the actual gaming community, which we can translate exactly into helping produce good virtual reality filmic content for VR.
So in the scope of the conversations that you're having, do you feel that is something that's kind of emerging in terms of game studios who are wanting to talk about live action VR film?
We're probably sort of stealing from them, to be quite honest. I don't think that it's probably not quite on their radar at the moment, but I see that there are a lot of films that will translate extremely well into a sort of VR environment. I'm thinking of a film like, for instance, Gravity, which I think would actually translate pretty well seamlessly into a virtual reality experience. But when you actually analyse that although that was that was filmed, it was in actual fact filmed and then composited totally in CGI in a gaming way. So that what you saw on the screen was only part of the panorama that the CGI artists had created to put the filmic elements back in. So I'd be really excited to see something like Gravity come into VR.
Okay. Well, as we would normally do towards the end of the show, I would normally ask what you think is the most significant change that's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years for your industry. It's going to change the face of your industry, whether that's a technological change or a cultural change or just an emerging trend of some sort. What you think that will be? Now, Steve, you've already had a chance at answering this particular question, so you're slightly more prepared than Kristen. So I'm going to give you the floor to tell us what you think.
I just want to say I think Steve is slightly more prepared for me on all levels of this call, but I appreciate you only calling it out here at the end, Tanya.
Well, I think there's lots of things which are going to be really exciting. But I think one of the things that has come out of from the discussions that we've had is also about how I think the audience will become much more collaborative. Actually, in how the outcome of films or the outcome of games within virtual reality, and I think that's one of the most significant things that will happen. I think people will start to be not totally passive, but where they sort of sit down in front of a screen and watch something now. Even by donning the headsets, you're actually becoming much more immersed in what's going on, and therefore you've got the ability to actually sort of look around you much more. And I think that will expand out as headsets, again, as we say, get lighter, and there'll be more things that you'll be able to do, and also the actual imagery that we can put in front of people's eyes is going to be of such high quality, it'll be indistinguishable from real life. I think those are the sort of two or three things that I'm sort of really excited about that's going to happen in the next sort of 4 or 5 years.
Wonderful. And Kristen, what would be the thing that's going to change the industry for you?
I definitely think it's going to be something in the VR or AR realm of things. I think, obviously, I think I can pretty safely say technology is around the headset piece and the immersive piece of that is going to become much lighter and much more user friendly and move into the mainstream a lot more. I don't know that I find Steve's thought process around the actual stories that we tell sort of very interesting. And I don't know that I think as storytellers, we're still going to want to be very much in control of that. And so I wonder if we will still lead people to the same conclusion and have them experience the story in a different way. But I think the way, and you're already starting to see this with YouTube, how, YouTube, I believe, has a watch this in VR option on some of the projects that they have on their site. So I think what people are going to be looking at mobily is going to increase even more. I think our mobile consumption, because you can literally watch something in the palm of your hand, and then you're going to be able to somehow take it and slide it into a viewer and experience it in a whole different way. And I think the storytelling around that, and that's what gets me excited, and that's what I'm trying to figure out. How do I tell a narrative story and incorporate VR somewhere into that so that it just heightens and enhances the experience for the viewer?
Okay. Great.
Yeah, actually, Tanya, there's one quick thing I'd like to sort of put in there as well, because I think it goes on from that. I think that with virtual reality, you've got the ability also to tell the same story from lots of different perspectives, and therefore you could actually view the same story again and again from different perspectives.
Lots of viewability and then repeat viewing, indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us today on this session. In order to allow our lovely listeners to be able to follow you and explore what it is you do and just find out more about both of you, we would ask you to share with us your social media handle of choice. Steve, what would that be?
Well, that's Twitter, and my handle is AR Reality.
Still think that's an awesome handle. Kristen, what would your handle be?
Mine is also Twitter, and you can follow me at Kristen Tello, ChristinTellO, or my company Tello Films, which is TELLOFILMS.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review. Thanks again for joining us on this Digital Jam session. DigitalJamSessions.com